Hi, Grim. So now we're recording, so this talk will be accessible after today's talk, and you'll be able to share it with whoever is not able to make it. And I think that is it for housekeeping, which brings me to what I'm very excited to do, which is to introduce my co-GrizzlyCorps Fellow, Shay Callahan, who is not only a close friend of mine, but is also an incredibly knowledgeable biologist who has taught me so much this year. So I'm very excited that she agreed to do this. So along those lines, Shay is the current GrizzlyCorps Fellow with Western Shasta Resource Conservation District, where she leads various forest health and wildfire resiliency projects in Western Shasta County. Prior to moving to Northern California for her GrizzlyCorps service year, Shay studied biology and geoscience at Hobart and William Smith colleges and conducted research on how land history affects salamander exploratory behavior in the Finger Lakes National Forest. After undergrad, she worked as a field intern for the Guppy Project in Trinidad and Tobago, where she conducted mesocosm behavioral experiments on guppies. She then went on to complete her master's degree in natural resources and environmental sciences at University of Illinois, where she studied salamander migrations and the effects of prescribed burns and salamander safety for her thesis. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Shay.
Thanks so much, Sabrina, and that was so nice. And thanks so much for the Land Trust for hosting this event. I went to the last one too, and it was a blast. So I'm glad I can contribute. Give me a second while I start to share my screen so we can get this rolling. Share. And then can everyone just see my presentation, or is it? Sweet. All right, so I'll get started. Awesome. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for Shasta Land Trust again for hosting this event. So I'll be discussing mostly my master's work, which was in Illinois, where I completed my master's, but it'll be about the migration phenology of imperiled Illinois salamander species. And yeah, and I completed this work through my lab, and I got a lot of funding through that lab, so I'll mention them a little bit later. But just a little bit of background. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with amphibians, but there's over 4,600 amphibian species documented presently, with around the majority being frogs, around 4% being caecilians, which are for all intents and purposes fancy worms, and then around 9% being salamanders. So I'm really glad people attended this talk. Not a lot of people, I don't know, have even seen or even recognized what a salamander is. But here I'm showing a picture right here, right now. So this is a salamander. They're usually kind of slimy. They have 4 limbs, and they usually have a really long tail. But they're really a cryptic species, which means they're not seen very often because they are both nocturnal, and a lot of them do spend a lot of time either on the forest floor, under logs and detritus or leaf litter. And some of them, a lot of them also spend a lot of time underground, which is the species that I'll be talking about today. So amphibian actually comes from the word, a Greek word that means both lives. So they live in both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So they're characterized by both, occupying both land and water. One of the caveats to this is their versatility is that they're also super sensitive to changes in both types of habitats. So even if the terrestrial habitat is great and their breeding habitat or wetland is deteriorating, it affects the population as well. So one thing that I'll also be talking about today is not all salamanders migrate, but a lot of them do migrate towards breeding habitat, which is typically wetlands, or it can be streams. And these streams are in most of these places are not occupied by much else besides other amphibians like frogs and such. They usually can't occupy spaces with fish because fish will usually eat their eggs or themselves. So They usually don't co-occur. And then one other thing, just a quick tidbit of newts versus salamanders. So all newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. Basically, there's not a ton of differences. Newts usually have rougher skin than salamanders, and they spend most of them are more aquatic, so they'll have more webbing between their toes and stuff as well. And they usually have really bright coloring because a lot of them are very toxic. So a lot of them will have like orange or yellow bellies. We're going to talk about that. And yeah, this is just a quick picture of the life of a salamander. So an adult salamander will migrate or already be in a wetland or a pond, will deposit eggs. The eggs will grow into little larvae with gills. And so in most cases, their gills will recede, and then they'll leave the pond as a little miniature version of the adult salamander with little vestigial nubs where their gills used to be. So that's just some quick background. So why should we care about amphibians at all? So one of the reasons that we should, as in general, just care about them is that they're bioindicator species. So this means that when the habitat's deteriorating, they are usually the first species to feel its effects. So they're really good red flag warning of, hey, something's wrong with the habitat, we should change something, or something bad is really happening, because they're so sensitive. Another reason is that they're actually really, even though you don't see them, they're really plentiful. So their biomass actually is very large. One study found that lungless salamanders can make up to 1/3 of the biomass on the forest floor, which is insane. And so they are both important as both prey to other species. They're a really energetic snack, but they also eat a lot of invertebrates on the forest floor. So they're just super important to the food web as well. Similar to a lot of species, they're under threat from both like climate change and invasive species, but the most prominent threats are habitat loss and habitat connectivity. So again, they're super vulnerable to habitat loss because of their biphasic life history, which means they're using both wetland and terrestrial habitat. So if they lose either one of those, then their populations are going to be impacted. Another thing that affects that is their low vigility. So if one of those habitats is affected, their ability to move to a new habitat is really low. So salamanders, if one salamander species was reported up to moving up to 1 mile, but that's like probably the max amount of distance their little legs can move. As you can see here, they're not super adapted for moving long distances. So if their habitat is destroyed, it's very hard for them to rebound and find enough energy to find new habitat. And this is just a fact for Illinois, but I'm sure the numbers are just as staggering or more staggering in California. But a lot of wetland habitat has been converted to agriculture. So a lot of because of wetlands produce really good soil and stuff. So people just drain them and in Illinois, they put a bunch of corn and soybean and stuff on them. So that's been really detrimental to salamander and a lot of amphibian species. So that's why we should care about them and when they're moving. So my study in particular is looking at phenology. So phenology is the study of timing of biological phenomena, such as migration. So phenology is super important to the life history of amphibians, especially since they're biphasic and occupy so many different areas and so many different niches in different habitats. The other thing is that movement for these guys can be super risky depending on the environmental factors or even their biological factors of size and age. So just deciding when they're going to leave their safer habitat, which is usually the terrestrial habitat, is super important of trying to figure out when protection is best for these guys. So some of the reasons why they might be moved, like why they might choose when they move or at certain times of the year and stuff is so resource availability for larvae. So if females are getting to these breeding wetlands where most of or my species likes to breed, they get to the wetlands earlier. If the females get to the wetlands earlier and lay their eggs, there'll be more invertebrates for the larvae to eat, so they can get bigger and there'll be less predation on them once they leave those wetlands. So that's they can confer this like fitness ability onto their offspring. Another one is the actual risk for the adults who are moving into the wetlands. So if it's warmer, if they move during the summer and stuff, then the soil moisture and the air temperature will be less conducive for holding water and stuff. So their skin will dry out faster, and that can risk desiccation or just death by like their skin drying out, which is another part. They're very sensitive to moisture. So these are actually study species. I love them. So they don't actually occur in California, unfortunately. So these are just some species in the Midwest and East Coast. But this is the Jefferson salamander, or Ambystoma jeffersonianum, and this is the silvery salamander. Now these two are both mole salamander species, Ambystoma, and this is because they spend like 90% of their life underground. And then they just spend 10%, the other 10% is them trying to get to the wetlands and breed for about, for a couple of weeks out of the year. And so, as I was saying kind of before, they go to the wetlands to breed, but they spend most of their lives underground, and then they'll also spend the winter in a sort of torpor or hibernation period. And so these actually, so these guys can actually live up to like 20-ish years too. So they're actually really important for a lot of food web stuff, and they can persist in the environment for a long time, which is awesome. Just going a little bit more in depth into each one. So this is Jefferson salamander and is state listed species, which is part of the reason why this research got funded. But this is a bisexual species, so they have both male and female. And so one of the things is that males will actually arrive to the ponds earlier than females, because this makes sure that they'll have a mate, or they'll make sure that they actually get to reproduce. Females, on the other hand, it's better for them to arrive to the wetlands later in the season, because there's less chance of the pond freezing, because some of these males will move in the winter when there's still snow on the ground. They don't want their eggs to freeze, but also females want more mate choice. They don't want just like a couple of wimpy guys who showed up early because they're nervous that they weren't going to be able to get their sperm out there. But yeah, so that's basically males will usually migrating before females. One of the other things is that, so there was one study that showed that these guys, these guys are spending most of their time in the soil and in a torpor during the winter. And this is because there's usually a permafrost layer, and they'll try and burrow below that before the winter starts so that they don't freeze. And then the permafrost layer kind of recedes as the spring starts. And so it's hypothesized that they'll kind of follow that permafrost layer as it starts to recede as it warms, so that they can eventually emerge from the soil and go to their wetlands to breed. That's one other thing. And then, so for the other, actually, I'll show you where they are in Illinois. This is like the southernmost site that I had, which is just, so it gets warmer faster too. So these guys are usually migrating earlier. In addition to that, so this is the silvery salamander. So these guys are extra special. They're like threatened species because they're an all female species, which means that there's no males. They only, so there's no males. There are male smallmouth salamanders, and so the only way that the silvery salamander can breed is by parasitizing spermatophores from these guys. So spermatophores are kind of laid in little like cones with a little sperm on top outside their in the water while they're in the wetland and stuff. So these guys will just come up and steal them, basically, which is crazy. So they're super dependent on their host that they're parasitizing from, which is super weird. But and so they're actually in direct competition with female smallmouth salamanders, which is another important thing to note. But yeah, so when I start graphing and start showing you guys some figures, there'll definitely be smallmouth salamanders included with the all-female silvery salamander species. And they were just at the located at the middle site in Illinois. Do you have any? Yeah, closer to Urbana-Champaign, if you know what that is. So I don't have a ton of time today, but I'm just going to basically just discuss what biotic and abiotic factors are influencing the probability of invisible salamander movement. So what is causing salamanders to move from the terrestrial environment to the wetlands? Like what weather patterns, like what biotic factors, like if they're male or female, why are they moving to these ponds? I just included these because I did a lot of work on my master's, and if you would like to hear me talk about those questions more, I can include my link to my master's presentation that's also recorded. On to my methodology. So there's multiple wetlands that I surveyed at each site. There's 2 wetlands for the Jefferson salamanders and 3 for the silvery salamanders. And essentially at each of these wetlands, I set up a drift fence, which is just aluminum flashing surrounding their breeding ponds. So basically, because they're a phosphorial species, or they spend most of their time underground, we have to catch them at their breeding wetland, because we do not know where they spend most of their time otherwise. So basically, we hedge our bets and we surround a known breeding pond with this fence. And then we also, every 5 meters, we put pitfall traps, or just buckets that are flush with the ground. So basically, the idea is that the salamander hits the fence, is like, oh, I'll just go around. And he keeps trying to go around, but then falls into a bucket. And you'll also notice that there's a lot of water and stuff in them and sponge to help them float. But salamanders are actually pretty good swimmers and can hold their breath, so it's okay. But so basically I would just catch them and count them, like how many salamanders are moving on this day. And I would just do that all from January to August, I would catch them. And then I'd also just take measurements. So I'd take snout vent length, which is there to their cloaca, and then also total length. I'd take weight. And then I also input pit tags. So I'd take a little needle and input a tiny little transmitter. And then so when I waved a wand over them, I could be like, oh, this is that salamander from that year or something, and figure out how frequently they're coming back to breed and if they're coming back to the same pond. So for the environmental variables of what I'm trying to kind of figure out, like why they might be moving to the wetlands, I downloaded data from NOAA. So I basically took precipitation data and also minimum temperature data. One important thing is that I took precipitation from the day before, because I don't control what the weather stations take, so they only just take 24-hour accumulation. They don't take hourly. So I had to just take from the day before, because they are nocturnal and they're moving nocturnally into these wetlands. And then I also, took minimum temperature. Soil inversion strength, I measured myself at each site. So I buried hobo loggers both at the surface, but also at 30 centimeters down, to try and figure out when the inversion, or when the soil surface got warmer than 30 centimeters down, where I hypothesized that they're hibernating. So basically, I would expect that once the soil surface got warmer, then down beneath, they would start to move up into the terrestrial habitat to try and breed, because they know it's going to be warm enough for the ice on the pond to be melted and for them to traverse it safely. I also did year as a parameter that I looked at, just because random things like, oh, like if like manure or something from a nearby ag field like polluted some of the ponds, or like there's over above average flooding or something. So that's just an important variable that I included. The day of year variable I also included was mostly to look at the difference between males and females moving. And then I also included for the silvery salamanders, because they only have one sex, or they only have females and stuff, I also included the smallmouth salamanders, because their numbers might be affecting when silvery salamanders are moving. And so after combining all the salamander data and the environmental data, I was able to create models. So these models are essentially just hypotheses that I have, that are just, I'm trying to model what I think what in the environment is making them move. Try not to be intimidated by all these. A priori, it's just hypotheses. So basically, like in all good science, you want a null hypothesis, so my null model. So is my model doing better than absolute complete randomness? Like, are salamanders just moving randomly and I just need to give up, or are there actual factors affecting their movement? The global model is the exact opposite of the null model. So if I throw the kitchen sink at this problem, well, is every single variable that I'm measuring important to their movement. So that's just top and bottom end of this modeling ranking basically. And then my precipitation model was basically the hypothesis. I think that salamanders are more likely to move when there's more rain because the threat of their desiccation or their skin drying out decreases because there's more moisture in the environment. The minimum air temperature is kind of the flip side of that. So I think that once the minimum air temperature reaches a certain threshold, I think the salamanders will want to move because one, it won't be the threat of freezing will decrease, but also the threat of them overheating and not having enough moisture in the environment during the summer will also decrease. My soil inversion strength model is more that hypothesis that I was talking about before, that once I think the surface gets warmer than the deeper soil, the salamanders will initiate their movement and start to emerge into the terrestrial environment. My day of year model was just to look at maybe it is just males and females just move differently without any environmental factors involved. And then these other two models were both looking at, do males and females move differently, but also in relation to minimum temperature. So are males moving at colder temperatures than females because they're moving earlier? And same thing with the precipitation model, are females moving when there's more rain or something like that. So all these a priori models were made like without me knowing much about the environment. Post hoc model basically means that I ran all these models and I figured out which variables were more important. And so I combined them into what I think would be the best model. And just a quick, side note, this is how I kind of felt just talking about all these statistical things. Like I was like, oh, like when I got into the field of biology, I really just love animals and nature and stuff. And then I kind of got bombarded during my master's with all of this statistical and programming. Like I had to just spend 2 years of teaching myself R and all these statistics. So if you guys have any questions and stuff about this later, I can most likely answer. But yeah, this is, unfortunately, to do good science, you have to make sure your stats are rigorous. So that's why I'm going through some of this stuff right now. But bear with me, it'll get to some good juicy data later. More stats. So basically, I just ranked all my models using this information criterion. Basically, it just means this information criterion just basically uses Occam's razor. So the simplest solution is usually the solution, but it also penalizes if you throw something like the kitchen sink. Like if you're just using every single variable in the world to describe it, then of course, like your model's going to describe it because you throw the kitchen sink at it, but that's not going to help you discover why salamanders are actually moving, and that's not going to be helpful to like land managers who want to know like what level of precipitation is good for salamander movement. So basically, for both Jefferson salamanders and silvery salamanders, the post hoc model where I included day of year precipitation and minimum temperature was the best model. And so this weight just means that they were the best weighted models, so they did better than all the models I showed in the previous slide. And these R-squareds are basically just mean correlations. So how much of the variation did it describe? Like how good was my model at predicting whether salamanders were going to move? And these are pretty good numbers. So like 1 is like basically 100%, and then 0.8 would be 80%. I will point out though that while the Jefferson salamander, this post hoc model did explain a lot of the variation here, it definitely explained less of it than this for the silvery salamander, which I'll point out one of the reasons why that might be later. And so next, I'm just going to show some figures that actually show what those models might mean and the direction of what each variable means. So on the x-axis, I plotted both precipitation, minimum temperature, and day of year. And then on the y-axis, is basically just movement probability. So 0, salamanders are not moving. And then 1, salamanders are definitely moving. So for the first variable in that model that I showed you, precipitation, typical to what I'd expect, the more precipitation there is, the likelihood of salamander movement increases for both males and females, for both Jefferson salamanders. For, and so actually the brown lines, the brown dotted lines are females, the blue dotted lines are males for Jefferson salamanders. For minimum temperature, there is a peak. which is what I would expect. So males do seem to like to move at a slightly cooler temperature than females, which is also what I would expect too. And yeah, so the one thing to note is that, so this gray is actually confidence intervals. And I think the function of why the confidence intervals get so large is because I just didn't collect any adults at those temperatures because they weren't moving then, but yeah, so it's mostly just, hopefully just a function of me just not collecting enough data at those temperatures. The next plot, which is day of year, which mostly is just trying to show the difference between males and females, you can definitely see the shift in the peak of the parabola. So males are definitely moving before females in this instance, almost around like almost 30-day difference. They're trying to get there a little bit earlier, even though there are definitely some females moving around the same time too. So for silvery salamanders, one thing I did was I did analysis that analyzed the significance of each of the variables. And while all 3 variables in the model for Jefferson salamanders was significant, only 2 of the variables in the top model were significant for silvery salamanders. So I did not include minimum air temperature because it was not actually predictive. It was just kind of like it's kind of like a hitchhiking variable in a model, which is a term in statistics that just kind of shows it was kind of there. It helped do some of the variation, but still might not be helpful in explaining what's actually happening. Anyways, x-axis is precipitation in millimeters and day of year, and then the y is still movement probability, 0s, no salamanders moving, 1 salamanders are moving. You can see a similar trend in that as the precipitation increases, all 3 salamander species, the female silvery salamanders, the female smallmouth salamanders, and the male smallmouth salamanders are moving with more precipitation. But you'll notice there's still almost over a 50% chance that silvery salamanders will move even though when there's no rain, which is kind of crazy and I did not expect. The other thing to note is that, so male smallmouth salamanders are moving before both female silvery salamanders and the female smallmouth salamanders are the people they actually want to breed with. What is interesting is that the silvery salamander peak is kind of right between the peak for this, the female smallmouth salamanders and the male smallmouth salamanders, which means they're trying to migrate before the female smallmouth salamanders, but after the male smallmouth salamanders who they're trying to parasitize their sperm for, which was a really interesting result from this data. And just because I'm not sure if everyone bought their day of year calendar with them, I kind of made this little graph just to show visually when everything is moving. And these were other parts of my study that I won't be discussing today, but just wanted to show how often salamanders are moving in throughout the year. One thing to note is that even though Jefferson salamanders are at a more southerly site, this gray dot, they're still moving around the same time as silvery salamanders. So both the adults are just kind of moving between this 3-month period from the soil to the wetlands. And so like my models had said before, precipitation, minimum air temperature, and male versus female biotic factors were important in just when they were moving to these wetlands. The one really compelling data that I collected from this was that the silvery salamanders, like I was saying before, the model wasn't as strong, and minimum air temperature was not considered a significant variable in my model analysis. So I was trying to figure out why, reasons for why that might be. Why are silvery salamanders not being explained as well by these environmental variables? And then I kind of remembered one of the summers where I collected over 2,200 marbled salamanders at one of their ponds. So this is a bucket of some of the marbled salamanders I captured that summer. Now these marbled salamanders are fall breeders, so I usually don't see them that often. But in this case, they're breeding at the same pond as the silvery salamanders, which means that 2,200 salamanders were fighting for resources with the silvery salamanders. So I kind of had this vision that all these salamanders were moving based on environmental factors, but I kind of didn't anticipate how much the biotic factors, such as resource competition between these salamanders and every other salamander in that pond, would be. So that was a really cool result, that they're kind of, and then they're also kind of adapted to how smallmouth salamanders move. So they're trying to parasitize the male smallmouth salamanders too, and also trying to beat out the female smallmouth salamanders, which is just really cool and kind of sneaky of them, which is super awesome. But yeah, so I was thinking definitely for the future for this project to consider more biotic variables when doing these studies, which is super cool. One other thing I think I would include too is maybe relative humidity. One thing I think the study could benefit from is maybe a grant to buy their own weather stations, just so that you can actually hourly take the precipitation data and take actual nighttime precipitation data, in addition to things like relative humidity, which is just measures how much moisture is actually in the air at that time, which I could not get with the basic equipment that I had. So, but yeah, so what does this results kind of mean? So a lot of this funding was actually because all these sites are on state park land. And so they're trying to do prescribed burns because invasive species like autumn olive out there are just so prolific, such a big problem out there. But so they want to be able to burn, but they don't want to burn all these state-listed species that are amphibians that are moving to these ponds. So that was part of my research, was to try and help them navigate when the best time to burn is. And so basically, from my day of year map, salamanders are kind of moving almost at all parts of the year, except for the months where it's really kind of dangerous to burn, which is unfortunate. But there's also things they can do. So this is kind of conducive for burning, but don't burn when there's a lot of rain the night and stuff before, and trying to make sure you're not burning all the way around wetlands. It's super important too. So one of the other things I was trying to do for this presentation was kind of get more concrete stuff on how fire impacts salamander migration, and impacts salamanders or their migrations. And it was really just mixed results. So some people were fire and salamanders go together, of course, but a lot of people also found that they didn't in the proximate future. So fire obviously kind of burns up leaf litter and impacts the soil moisture. So immediately after a fire might not be great for salamander migration. So trying to make sure you're not burning right during the crux of their migrations, or when there's a really really prolific movement is really important too. But in the long run, salamanders usually don't. They actually migrate, and some studies have shown they migrate less than invasive species, and also the soil pH of certain species is not conducive for their movement, and it's is not great for their skin. So being able to burn and maintain a healthy forest, which is one you can usually see through, would in the long run probably help salamanders. So even though there's definitely not a consensus on whether you should burn for salamanders, I'm definitely of the mind that fire should be brought back to the landscape in a lot of different places, and that in the long run, I think salamanders and a lot of amphibian species would benefit from these burns, especially just in terms and just making sure you're not burning the complete circumference of a wetland or something, and just making sure some of the sides still maintain some of that leaf litter and soil moisture, and then just diversifying the burn regimen in general. So not doing it every other year in the same spot or something like that, and just making sure that people are monitoring these species so that we can eventually get a consensus on these cryptic species that people don't think about but are super important to the food web and the environment. So one of the other really important things is that, like I was saying before, 90% of wetlands are gone in Illinois, which is just a staggering number. So just conservation of breeding habitat and that like connecting habitat is super important to salamander just population persistence. And so work that's being done, like some of the stuff that like Shasta Land Trust is doing and making sure it's conserving waterways and like vernal pools and things is just super, super important. And making sure that you are being really cognizant of your management. So making sure you're not doing clear cut, which I don't know who would be doing that, but no clear cutting, and just like making sure you're partially harvesting areas so that there's still like canopy cover and leaf litter and stuff in areas so that amphibians can like migrate and forage and do all the things they need to do. And yeah, so definitely just like conserving areas and not a lot of how it's funded was actually through the Illinois tollway. So a giant highway was built and destroyed a lot of habitat. And then they funded this project to kind of see like, oh, like how are the salamanders doing? Like how many like are there and stuff after we kind of destroyed a lot of their habitat and like tried to rebuild like half as good ones. And the answer is like they're still obviously continuing. The person who replaced me is continuing it, but the answer is not amazing. They could definitely be doing better after losing a lot of their habitat to erode. So just making sure that people, I think we need to stop like destroying wetlands. There's so few of them, and we need to make sure that like maybe honestly, the definition of conservation maybe needs to change too, and make sure that we're cognizant of what climate change is going to do. So while places that are conserved are probably more resilient to climate change, like maybe we need to help it out a little bit too, and not just let it kind of sit stagnant as like climate change kind of changes the plant species and the other species that can be around, and understand where climate refugia are, or places that are like more resilient to climate change. And this may not be as true in California, but lots of forest land in the US is privately owned by like a lot of like companies or people. So just making sure we also talk about good land stewardship and making sure that people understand the importance of wetlands in both their own like ecosystem, but in like the scheme of the world that has lost so much wetland habitat to agriculture. So there's that. So my little conservation rant, but yeah. So like making sure that salamander migrations and stuff are protected, that'd be nice. Just a quick acknowledgement to funding that I got for this project, field techs and human support animals that helped me just get through really tough schooling and stuff during a pandemic, which was awesome. But I also briefly wanted to show some just like eye candy. So these are some of the local salamanders that you can find in Shasta County. So this is, I've really only seen the rough skin newt and an Encintino in the redwoods. But anyways, so this is the southern long-toed salamander. This is and this is the Shasta black salamander. A lot of these are really just found by Shasta Lake, honestly. And then this is the Samwell Shasta salamander, the California slender salamander. And then this is just the Shasta salamander too. And then rough skin newt. And then this actually looks really similar to the California newt as well. I think the only way to tell them apart is to measure their eye size, which is kind of difficult to do if you're just like an amateur herpetologist. So probably rough skin newt, but California newt and Sierra newt are also out there in Shasta County. And then the Oregon Encintino, which is also a pretty charismatic one. And then there's also the Pacific giant salamander, which I've been trying to find desperately, but I have not seen one here yet. Anyways, these are some of the guys that might be in your backyard or breeding in some vernal pools that are around here. So keep an eye out, and make sure if you are trying to like handle them and stuff, your hands are clean. A lot of pictures that I showed with salamanders, like I was wearing gloves because I don't want to pass diseases or anything. And I make sure I bleach whatever shoes I'm wearing into these wetlands, so I'm not also carrying diseases or parasites or something in between these places. So that's also, yeah, good. So I definitely want people to get into amphibians, but make sure you're respecting their place too. Yeah, that was definitely kind of a fast overview of my stuff. But if you have any questions about my methodology or just like salamanders in general, definitely share.
Amazing. Thank you, Shay. That was so good. Yeah, as Shay said, would love to open it up to whatever questions popped up for you during that. I I imagine that meme was coming up over and over again for you. Because I was just like a flashback to all of my biology classes too. I'm rusty, so yeah, any questions that you have for Shay, now is a good time to do that. In the chat, feel free to unmute, whatever you prefer. Yay, from Bethany. Hi, Bethany. She says, thank you, Shay. Wondering if there's any research you know of on the impacts of wildfire on salamanders.
Yeah, so the literature is conflicting a lot of times, but also wildfire can just be so kind of different. So I think like a lot of things like intense wildfires that just scorched earth, like leave no leaf litter or any regeneration or anything except for invasive species, like invasive weeds and stuff, is really bad for them. And they do live in the soil and under all this detritus and stuff. So if that burns up, it's likely they burn too. So that's, yeah. But, you know, low intensity fires that, you know, should have been on the landscape for a very long time and were taken from the landscape for, yeah, reasons, are definitely, I think, would be beneficial. There's definitely, yeah, some studies that show, yeah, because it helps reduce like some invasive species, and it also, yeah, just helps with regeneration and make sure the canopy cover of like mature trees definitely covers more than younger trees. So that's definitely good to like, yeah, help maintain older trees and keep the like the micro climate of the forest floor like more like just better for salamander skin and habitat and invertebrates too.
Very cool, thank you.
Do salamanders live around seasonal creeks or do they need more water? So they totally can. What limits, so salamanders, they like a lot of canopy cover around a lot of their wetlands, although a lot of newts are kind of, will sometimes just like, because they're a little bit more hardy than salamanders, will like literally live in culverts on the sides of roads sometimes. And it's like, what are you doing? But they find a will. There's a will, there's a way. So a lot of them can definitely do seasonal creeks as long as there isn't fish. Fish are a super big predator for their eggs and them. So if there's fish in these waters, then there's not, so it's, if it's seasonal, so if there's only water in it part-time, then fish can't live in them. So they'll definitely occupy those waters, depending on a couple other factors too. So the pH of the water, their skin is super sensitive above like a certain pH, depending on each species. Yeah, and how much food availability too. So if there's, yeah, if there's like no invertebrates or anything to feed on to, they'll eat algae and stuff, but they really don't like it. They really prefer the bugs and the mosquito larvae. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it definitely ranges on what kind of water. Like I definitely have had like basically the Illinois version of Caltrans like take me on the roadsides and they're like, are these salamanders? And I'm like, on the sides of these roads and stuff that would, you know, shouldn't be occupied by anything. And I'm like, yeah, there's like, there's nothing out here except for this road ditch. So they found something. So yeah, definitely depends on the species of how vulnerable they are, but they can definitely occupy little puddles of water if they need to. okay, so Kaylee asked a good question. Did the land management agency you worked with on this project end up doing any prescribed burns? And if so, are you aware of any of the monitoring they did for amphibians after the burn / any resources to look into for amphibian monitoring methods to utilize before and after a prescribed burn? Yeah, so the state park is not super well funded. Like there's just like, I would just email this one poor guy who was definitely like working overworked and was basically just trying to make it so the park wasn't completely covered in trash. So it was definitely more of like my prerogative to go do a lot of the monitoring and stuff. And I remember one day when I was at a site in Chicago, and I like went to go get lunch or something somewhere after doing half of my monitoring, and then I came back and they had like already burned the site and they had like not told me. And I was like, oh, like I'm glad this happened. It would have been cool to like know it was happening today during my lunch break. And they burned like pretty close to my site and stuff, but like the numbers and stuff looked fine or whatever, but I was still like, oh wow, like more coordination would have been awesome with that. So it's definitely like these state parks are not super well funded, and I definitely wish there was a more rigorous like monitoring system. But it was definitely just like, especially during COVID, it was literally just me out there trying to cover like, I think it was like around like 7 hours between some of my field sites. Like it was a haul. So, but also monitoring resources to look into amphibian monitoring methods. I definitely could share a few papers where I was doing recapture, mark and recapture studies where I'm looking at like, so I can count concrete numbers and see who's coming back and tell the age of some of these salamanders, which is super cool. But a lot of times it's really hard to maintain, like, so those fences that I had to maintain, I had to make sure I was there like every day, because if stuff needs to breed, like I need to make sure I'm not making sure I'm not impeding their breeding process. And like I'd also catch a lot of snakes and like turtles and stuff that were also just trying to get like a drink of water. So those were definitely hard maintenance. So a lot of people actually do like kind of random transects of those fences around the wetlands, so things can still access them if they need them, but there's a certain probability that like salamanders will hit these certain cardinal directions. So they'll just put like a drift fence like on like 5 sides of the wetland, not completely encircling it. So there's like a chance that like a turtle or something needs to get through, it can pass. So that's definitely something people do. And then pit tagging, which I was doing, is actually it's really cool and it can help with long-term studies a lot, but it's definitely money. So I did at one point end up using alphanumeric tags, which are just like a little piece of plastic that's like highlighter green or something, so you can read the number on it and stuff too, which is like slightly cheaper. And then I also like watched a lot of YouTube videos on how to use those things properly, so I wasn't harming the animal. So definitely some of that stuff is technical, and there are definitely like places that know how to do professional amphibian monitoring, but you usually need a little bit of money to make sure you can upkeep it. And like long-term studies for these wildfire things, I think, are super important, because a lot of the proximate stuff is like, yeah, if you burn like the ground and stuff, like they're obviously not going to want to move through it. But I think in like once the regeneration and stuff starts to occur and the forest starts getting healthier, I think the results would start to show that salamanders do appreciate like mature forests and with lots of growth. So yeah, sorry for a little bit of ramble, but thanks for the great questions, you guys.
I also was curious in tracking like their movement between the soil and then the water bodies. What is that? I'm sure there's a range, but what is that actual distance like on average about?
So yeah, it's funny. We didn't like study that at all, but just from papers and things. It can range from like, I think a mile is probably the largest distance they would want to cover. But probably like within like 500 feet, like they're trying to limit, because that's so much work for them to move to those wetlands and stuff. So they're trying to like you know, not be in the floodplain of that wetland and stuff if there's like a flood or anything, but still trying to like be in a good place where there's a lot of invertebrates and food available for them. So it's definitely a balance between that. Like, you know, sometimes I'd like lift up a log or something during lunch and I'd like see one, I'd be like, what are you doing here?
I can picture it. Do you have a favorite type of salamander? Have we talked? I don't know if you've ever shared that with me.
Oh, I love them all, but definitely during this project, I mean, marbled salamanders are like the most beautiful and charismatic ones, but
Yeah.
the derpiest ones are spotted salamanders because they're like really thick sausages, unlike some of the other salamanders that are like more agile and like more beautiful in the water and stuff. Like spotted salamanders are like really prolific breeders and they can kind of survive a lot of habitat, but they're just like little, like they're like really thick little chunkers, so they can tip over on their bellies really easily, and they'll just be like, meow. And they're just like kind of ridiculous creatures that I don't know how they made it this far, but I'm so glad they did. They're just like
Amazing.
not agile or intelligent, but they're so cute.
Okay, any other questions for Shay? We're just about at time, so we'll wrap up soon. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing all of it. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we recorded today's session, so it will be up on our website probably by the end of today, so you can share it with those that didn't get to make it. And our next Conservation Lunch Series talk will be sometime in September. And along with that, we'd love to hear kind of your interests and what topics you're most excited about learning. So you can find all of our emails, anyone at the Land Trust, and send us an email on topics that you want to hear about. That will help us kind of guide our search for speakers. And anything else you want to share, also we welcome. And other than that, just thank you so much for being here with us today. And again, thank you, Shay. I learned so much. And I know everyone else did too. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you guys.
Mm-hmm.